Food is fuel for your body, your mind, and definitely your sport. But let's face it, nutrition is confusing, and the expectations on girls and women to be thin and have a six-pack are exhausting. If you've ever been frustrated with your body, confused about nutrition, obsessed with eating healthy, or guilty when you don't, underate, overate, or overtrained, and overwhelmed with all the pressure, then this podcast is for you. Nutrition can be easy, you can take control of it, but it might start with letting go of control by asking for help and making a change. I'm Lindsay Elizabeth Cortez, sports dietitian and owner of Rise Up Nutrition, where I empower female athletes to overcome nutrition concerns and perform at their highest level, to stop being confused by all the mixed or harmful messages, and finally have confidence in your body as a fierce, fit, and fueled female athlete. Hello, fans and listeners. It's Lindsay Elizabeth Cortez here, your host, and I'm joined today with another registered dietitian. Heather Caplan, pronoun she, her, is a weight-inclusive registered dietitian. She's the founder of Weight Inclusive Nutrition and Dietetics, also known as WIND, which hosts continuing education and connection events for dietitians. Heather hosted the RD Real Talk podcast for over 5 years, having hundreds of conversations about non-diet nutrition. She also co-founded the Lane 9 Project, a community for athletes struggling with disordered eating and eating disorders. Her work in the non-diet spaces, including working with clients, organizations, and healthcare providers, has been featured on The Today Show and in magazines like The Washington Post, Runner's World, Outside Magazine, and Eating Well. She's a parent to 3 littles, likes to run long distances, and wishes it was always summer ale season. So Heather, thank you so much for joining on this podcast today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I would love to just jump into it right away, Heather, with talking about some definitions, I think, of kind of how you approach your practice. Like right in your bio, it said you were a weight inclusive registered dietitian. And if we head to your website, if we listen to your podcast, you talk about HAES, anti-diet approach. And I just thought that this would be good to just like set the stage, give our listeners some good solid definitions so they know what this conversation is going to be about and stuff. So could we start with just that weight inclusive approach to nutrition? What exactly does that mean? What's your definition of?
Yeah, so weight inclusive approach to nutrition to me actually means being neutral about weight instead of seeing weight as a primary marker of health or as like the definer of health, seeing weight as like a measurement that we have, but not one that we rely on to like determine someone's health status, which we can also like explore. How are we determining someone's health status and what does that really mean? But it means having a practice that is inclusive of all bodies, that is respectful and accessible to all bodies, and really examining the education that we receive in our healthcare model around what weight means and what it doesn't mean, and looking around and seeing like how inclusive or exclusive more often are these spaces, and, how accessible are they to folks in different body sizes. And again, I would actually more often use the term weight neutral because I feel like it's important to emphasize a neutrality around weight instead of, again, like looking at a BMI or looking at a weight number and making an assumption about someone in either direction or in any space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. And even though, like, if you look on my website, I haven't necessarily used that to describe my practice. I do want to just state that I'm in agreement with that, and all my clients would know too. Like, I don't talk about weight in our sessions, or if we do, it's just understanding, okay, weight exists, like it's a measure of gravity. It's something that exists, but is it the determinant of health? Is it the determinant of success? Like, no. And there's lots of things. As you mentioned, there's a lot of things that can make up how we determine health. But I think the traditional practice of dietetics and maybe what you and I learned in school, I know I learned it in school, it was super weight focused. And so it's actually like in my practice and yours too, as a dietitian, we've had to kind of like unlearn some of what we learned in school.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the research papers that you will see on this, kind of the contrasting the weight normative or weight centric approach to weight inclusive, highlights the fact that really a lot of our healthcare education, and this has evolved over the years, but I went through school in the early 2000s, and this was certainly true 20-ish years ago, like it's so centered around weight, and there's a normative weight, there's a normal BMI category. And so everything is centered around and sort of compared to that versus like zooming out, which is a term I use a lot for in many different contexts of seeing just like bodies exist on a spectrum, people exist on a spectrum. That's actually really normal. Like trying to fit everyone into a certain like BMI range, which is sort of subject to like the climate of the era, if you will, like those numbers change, those ranges change. That's not indicative of like all types of populations and human bodies, et cetera. So instead of like centering that normal range or a normal weight or quote unquote like ideal body weight, we just are inclusive, right? Of different body types, different body weights, different genetics, different ethnicities, races, like lifestyles, cultures, et cetera. So yeah, our education does center, at least right now, it does center around this idea that like there's a range of body weight that's quote unquote normal and quote unquote healthy for all people. And it's just like, why are we not questioning that? It's so wild,
Yeah. And aside from questioning that, there's real research when you dig into the research that ultimately disproves the truth in that statement.
Right.
That like, this is what normal or healthy is. Like we have so much research to say that actually, let's just go with the BMI example just for the sake of it, because it's something I think people can relate to, that what is classified under BMI standards as an overweight category is actually a really healthy category when we look at markers of health like morbidity, mortality, long-term chronic diseases and stuff like that. And again, that's not all that determines health, but I'm just saying like, if you look at the research, it doesn't even line up with that.
Right. And I always say like there should be a huge asterisk around like BMI, how our like collective BMI has changed over the past few decades. Like anyone who went through healthcare education in the early 2000s has seen the map of the US of like how BMIs got higher and higher, like the average BMI of a state got higher and higher in the US. And I'm like, the huge asterisk here is that they actually changed the range from like normal weight to quote unquote overweight in the late 90s. So like, why aren't we talking about that? Like one, the subjectivity of it, but two, how like one person could have been quote unquote healthy and quote unquote normal one day. And then we're suddenly like launched into a different category the next day just because like some team of people at an agency was like, let's actually move that because we just decided to do that. It's like all of these things are so wild.
Which is literally what happened.
It's literally what happened.
What happened. Just for our listeners, like we're not just talking like one day that was it the NIH made a switch of like.
Yeah, I think it was NIH. And I think it was like the late 90s, maybe 1997. I've actually looked for some articles around it and it's really hard to find because the internet wasn't as like commonly used for disseminating news at the time. I think I found one like screenshot of an article, maybe from like CNN or something about like, oh, researchers at NIH decided that they wanted to move the, metrics for quote unquote overweight to start at 25.1 or whatever it is, just because it was like an easier number to remember. And I'm like, and like insurance and healthcare practices, like so much rides on that.
Yeah.
And it's, again, like not something that's being challenged or questioned very often in those spaces, which is really concerning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So understanding that like the science and these metrics and having a weight-centered approach is really it's not based on science, and it's also not healthy, or it's not appropriate for all these different people, different situations, different backgrounds, different genetics. Like, so your approach is just, how do we be inclusive? How do we address your health, your nutrition without weight being the center of it?
Yeah.
Sounds like such a simple concept.
Doesn't it? I do think that, I think most folks would agree, and I certainly believe this to be true. Like weight changes can sometimes tell us things, like weight suppression can tell us things, and maybe like a rapid change in weight in any direction could tell us something. But again, that's not like what we've kind of been trained to do, is to like almost weaponize that against people and like make assumptions about it versus just to be curious about it. And I'm sure there are many weight-centric providers who are like, oh, no, I'm just curious about it. I ask questions and I don't make assumptions, but that's not necessarily the norm. Like the number of people in my life who text me after a bad like healthcare experience of like, this happened, like maybe my cholesterol changed or my weight changed or something changed. And my doctor just like gave me a handout on healthy eating. I'm like, no questions, no, like no getting curious about it. And I think because the weight centric model has just become so normal, we've gotten into a space of like very lazy healthcare across the spectrum. Like, I don't mean to just put doctors in the spotlight here. Like it's true across the spectrum. So yeah, I think, coming at it from a more inclusive model is one, like, again, that baseline understanding of bodies exist in different shapes and sizes, and we don't need to quantify or qualify that. That's just a thing that is true. And like weight is also something that can give us some information. It's just how are we using that? And is it in an effective, like actually evidence-based and inclusive, respectful way?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So continuing with like definitions and stuff, this sounds to me like it would be very similar to the definition of HAES, health at every size. Is there a differentiation? And I do know that health at every size, HAES, is like also a trademarked term. So maybe could you tell us, can you define for our listeners, what is HAES?
Sure.
And yeah, how does that relate to what you were just speaking of?
Yeah, health at every size is a trademark owned by ASDA, which is the Association for Size Diversity in Health. ASDA serves the community. So it's not necessarily a group of healthcare professionals. There are healthcare professionals that are members of ASDA. I'm a member of ASDA, but it serves the community at large. So anybody who wants to support this movement, this paradigm shift that HAES supports, is welcome in those spaces. And they have a lot of trainings and resources for folks on their website. I think it's now sizediversity.org. And health at every size through ASDA has 5 principles, and weight inclusivity is one of them. They have also the organization at large has undergone a lot of changes over the past 2 years. So I'll be curious to see kind of what comes of those principles. I don't know. They might be changing. They might be kind of revised, so I don't want to speak too much to those, but I would say like bigger picture, HAES is something that is trying to change the way that we treat weight and health together in the healthcare system and culturally. So when I think of HAES, I think more about like a paradigm that provides us some structure and language around increasing access to care, regardless of health, regardless of size, regardless of so many other things that actually are huge barriers to equitable and respectful healthcare in the US. I can't speak for other places, but we have many like either life-affirming, life-saving, both of those things, surgeries that have BMI cutoffs. We have rampant weight stigma in healthcare, both in healthcare professionals and healthcare systems. We have insurance policies that won't cover certain services or like access to care in certain BMI categories or because of someone's weight. We have pathologized weight, like we have quote unquote obesity defined as a disease, which we could dive into that if you want to. So like all these ways in which there are so many barriers to, again, respectful, equitable, and accessible healthcare based on weight and size assumptions and like just true weight and size barriers. So health at every size, when I think of ASDA and I think of the work they do through health at every size, I think of increasing access to care, increasing respectful and equitable care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, that like everybody should have an opportunity and access to care for their health, at any size and every size. And I think that's the fundamentals. And so that weight neutral approach is certainly one way to do that. But yeah, there's a lot in there. And so the next definition, again, all of these things are things that I love and I resonate with, but I also I think you just as a dietitian, you're like, I'm weight neutral, I'm anti-diet. And so you have this, I think a lot stronger versus I'm over here, I believe in all this and I practice it, but I call myself the sports dietitian, right? So there's just I think there's little niches and stuff. So the next one that I love, this term that I love is just the anti-diet, the anti-diet dietitian, the anti-diet approach to nutrition. So can you kind of define that?
Yeah. So I'm in my head right now because I feel like so many people say anti-diet. I'm like, it's always been anti to me. So I say anti-diet, anti-diet, whatever. And that is also interchangeable in most spaces with non-diet. Just depends on someone's preference. And I think a lot about the emotions that a word evokes. And like when you hear anti-diet, it's like, oh, I am against diet culture. Yeah. And it can feel sort of negative. So some people don't like that. So to each their own for sure. But anti-diet is essentially kind of taking a stance against the norms of diet culture. And again, I speak through the lens of someone who has lived in the US my whole life. So that's my diet culture experience. I also speak through the lens of someone who holds a lot of body privilege, white privilege. And so my experiences in diet culture are very different than someone who doesn't hold those same privileges, right? So anti-diet, again, is sort of like, I see diet culture and I see that it has infiltrated our healthcare system, our healthcare education, dietetics, and the culture at large. And so kind of naming myself as an anti-diet dietitian is me sort of saying like, yeah, we don't do that here. Like we don't follow those rules here. We make up our own things. Like we decide what healthy means for us. We don't have food rules. We are neutral about weight. We're inclusive, etc.
Mm-hmm. And what's so cool about this approach, which is why I am personally and professionally in agreement with it, is because it comes back to the fact that nutrition and health is individualized, right? Which is the way it was always supposed to be.
Yeah.
or it always should be. And I do feel like we have a long way to go regarding diet culture things and all this that we're talking about. But I do feel a trend coming of people at least appreciating and respecting that like nutrition is not a one size fits all and this really individualized approach. And so I think that talking about things like a non-diet or anti-diet is helpful to people to say, well, this is what works for me. What works for you might be different. This is what works for me. And kind of just going on this individualistic approach, which is super, super helpful for everybody. And should be the way for all healthcare, right? Like even like if we're going to talk about not nutrition, but like medicine, right? Like you're going to need different types of medicines, different forms, different doses for each person. And so we can think the same thing, like all healthcare needs to be individualized.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So your journey as a dietitian, Heather, like did it start like this?
Yeah.
With really wanting to focus on non-diet, weight neutral like approach? Or like I mentioned before, was it kind of a process of like unlearning and relearning?
Yeah, I think for so many of us, it's always going to be a process of unlearning because our education is still so like kind of leans toward, not kind of heavily leans towards like one way of practicing. And I do think that that's changing a little bit. I know through WIND that like there are programs that are more inclusive now and that focus on, you know, cultural humility and inclusive care and weight inclusive practices. But I digress. My journey, I will say again, like speaking to what I mentioned earlier about like body privilege and white privilege within dietetics specifically, like when I got to college and I went into a nutrition class, like I saw a lot of me, you know, like it felt like, oh, okay, there's a lot of people around me who look like me. And I think we as humans, like we are sort of drawn to that sense of belonging, that sense of community. And so like the perfect storm of like having disordered eating patterns at the time that were sort of justified, if not like praised within the dietetics curriculum and like seeing myself in the other students in the program, like those two things combined, I think just kind of solidified like, okay, yeah, dietetics, like that sounds great. I'll do that. And so I studied dietetics and definitely like things got worse for me before they got better. Like my disordered eating patterns got more intense and more severe through the first like 2 years of education. And then I would say the next 2 years, because I did my undergrad in nutrition, so 4 years of studying this, I was like, now that I'm seeing that what I was doing wasn't healthy for me, I am sort of questioning what we're being taught because what I was doing was really similar to what we're being taught. And like there was just that like seed planted of a disconnect or of cognitive dissonance of like, if that didn't feel good for me, why would it feel good for other people? Not to project my own experience, but to try to see like, if this is what happened for me in my health, like, how could it be true that it's healthier for someone else to do that? And so that was just like a question I had. It's, again, sort of a seed that was planted, and it would take years for me to really like fully flush that out. But because again, I don't want to project my own experiences onto someone else. So who am I to say like, well, if this was true for me, it's true for everyone. Like that's never the case. But then I went into practice and I started in public health. I started at a WIC program, and then which now as a parent, I'm like, oh man, like some education before that would have gone a long way. But, and then I went into corporate wellness pretty much. I had like a little bit of a break between those two, but then I spent a few years in corporate wellness where at the time, super weight centric, like BMI was everything. Like, are you reducing the overall population BMI of like a client or an employee group, weight loss challenges, like fitness challenges, all the things. And we did health coaching, which for me was the most like illuminating part of the job. Like I talked to probably hundreds, if not thousands of people over those 4 or 5 years and was just like, this isn't working for anyone unless we put air quotes around quote unquote working and the person has become like very rigid to the point where like their quote unquote health behaviors are actually impacting other areas of their life. And so seeing that just across like so many different populations, different types of people in different types of like living situations, like urban, rural, everything in between. Like we had truck drivers, we had overnight shift workers, we had like bankers, like everything in between. It was like, this doesn't work for anyone.
No.
So what are we doing? And then I just felt like very disenchanted with dietetics and was like,
yeah. And then you just feel lost.
Like, what is happening? And it also just, I would say I was like kind of borderline weight neutral at the time. Like we would do these health screenings where people got weighed and they got their finger pricked and they got their like waist measured. And then they would come sit down with us and be like, what does all of this mean? And I would be like, it's okay. No, you don't need to, like, these are just like a snapshot. And I was like, just ignore all those numbers. Let's talk about these. Like if we had, again, a finger prick. So you have like some lab values, I suppose, like a general sense of lab values. I would just like try to focus on those. So anyway, yeah, like was really ready to just step away. And that's when I can't remember exactly how, but I did kind of stumble upon or sort of like discovered in some way through the grapevine, like the intuitive eating book and non-diet podcasts. And this was 2014, 2015. So the landscape was different at the time.
It was
like very different at the time. And then I just like dove all in and was like, give me all the information. Like, give me the podcast, give me the studies, give me the intuitive eating book, give me the health at every size resources. Like, I just want to absorb all of it. And then we like fast forward to today.
Hey fans, I hope you are enjoying this conversation so far, and we'll be back to it in just a moment. But first, I want to pause and let you know that this episode is brought to you by the Female Athlete System of Transformation, aka the Fast Track to overcome disordered eating and use food as fuel to perform at your highest level. The Female Athlete System of Transformation is my unique program and proven systems to guide female athletes to understanding and implementing the proper nutrition for their sport, life, and health. Myself and my team of registered sports dietitians work one-on-one with clients to address their unique needs and counsel them through the nutritional and behavioral changes needed. Many female athletes who resonate with disordered eating, mental guilt around food and body, relative energy deficiency in sport or female athlete triad, amenorrhea, repeat injuries due to negligent nutrition, or frankly, just a lack of knowledge and understanding on their fueling needs, have seen incredible success in the Fast Track. After years of working as a sports RD, I've compiled the most effective ways for female athletes to learn nutrition, be supported, be challenged, and ultimately find their success with fueling as fast as possible. So don't wait another day. Get to your goals faster by joining the Female Athlete System of Transformation. Look in the show notes or head to the website to book a free call and learn more. Okay, now let's get you back to the conversation. Enjoy.
I'll be really interested to to see what the next generation of dietitians is like. And you might have some insight to that, just considering your work with WIND, which we'll get to in just a moment. But like,
yeah,
because back thinking like your journey is very similar to mine as well, where it's like once becoming a dietitian after all the schooling and then kind of also figuring out like, this doesn't even work for me. Like,
yeah.
and this isn't really working for clients and people I'm working with. Like, it's just, this isn't the right approach. And then discovering on my own. Yeah. Intuitive eating, weight neutral approach, like all of those things just like on my own and kind of like doing all of that outside of the curriculum, outside of the credentialing, and then having it just like trying it with clients and in my workspace and seeing it work for clients. Right. And so having that shape my career field. So I'd be really interested in what the next generation of dietitians who have been exposed, people through social media, through everything now, like so many more people have learned of intuitive eating or know about HAES and are open to these concepts. And I don't know that the actual curriculum has truly changed, but like, it'll be interesting to see how the next generation of dietitians, if I don't know, it's tough because some things are better, some things are worse.
I was going to say, I think they're like exposed on both ends of the spectrum, like both extremes of the spectrum, right? Like we hear about these like wild TikTok trends around like quote unquote nutrition. You can't even, it's not nutrition, but like,
yeah,
you hear these wild trends on both sides of like, you know, we have, not that I want to say, well, like, again, you have these kind of like wild things that people are doing with food and restriction on social media. And then you also have like much easier exposure and more accessible exposure to information around non-diet practices. So you have both. And no, the curriculum has not changed, but we do see a lot of students in the WIND community and at WIND events. And we have more professors who are looking for support in the WIND Facebook group. Like, hey, I'm bringing weight inclusivity into the curriculum, which like the curriculum is set. And that's going to take a long time to change because it's not like you can just decide to do it differently. But like you can change assignments. You know, there was one thread recently about like, hey, I know that standard assignment in Nutrition 101 is to have them like track their food for 3 days.
I hate this assignment. I hate it.
Yeah. So like, how can we do that differently? And like, what are people doing to like fulfill that requirement, but to not have students track their food or not use something like a food tracking app to do that, which then often can trigger really disordered patterns or disordered beliefs around food, right? So there are definitely some shifts. I will add, just like relevant to the listeners here, that a big shift for me was also like being in the running community. Like, as you probably know, but we haven't talked about yet, like running is huge for me. It's a huge part of my life. It's how I met like so many friends when I came out of college, and you're like, how do I make friends? Like running was
Join
that.
a running club.
Yeah, running was that for me for a very long time. And I feel like transitioning from like the dietetic space during my like 9 to 5 to the running space for fun at night. One, there is a lot of overlap because runners have a lot of interest in nutrition, right?
Mm-hmm. A lot.
But it was also like, wow, this is like such a nice space where we don't always talk about these things. And like, we're just like talking about races and we're trying to have fun. And then we go to happy hour afterwards, or we go get dinner together or whatever. And so like that kind of freedom piece for me, or like examining, you know, like if I want to do this thing, if I want to be a runner, if I want to enjoy this activity and this hobby, like one, I have to be fueling myself well enough to do it. And two, like it's way more fun when I'm not stressed about going to dinner with people afterwards or like having happy hour afterwards, when like we can just be a little bit more relaxed about all of these things, you know?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's interesting because in some ways, like in regards to disordered eating and being super regimented with nutrition and some practices that are actually aren't super healthy for us, like sometimes athletics can heighten that because of the pressure around having the, how many air quotes are we using?
A
in
lot of
today's
air
podcast?
Quotes. Yeah.
Quote unquote air quotes.
Yeah.
We can't say 2 sentences without it. But sometimes athletics can fuel disordered eating because of trying to achieve that ideal runner's body or ideal gymnast body or whatever it might be, or that pressure that like I have to get my nutrition on point to perform well. But your experiences were quite the opposite of that, of like actually with joining a running club, like we had beers and food, and I was motivated to be fueled for my run. I had an amazing client session yesterday. She had a light bulb, and this is the thing, everybody has to come to it on their own, but I'm just going to share it. She was like, I need to fuel forward. I need to fuel so that I can train. I need to fuel now so that I can train. I don't need to train and then eat and make up for it after. It needs to be the opposite. And I was like, yes, this light bulb went off for her. And it was so exciting. But it seems like that was your story too, of the motivation. I need to be fueled if I want to be a part of this running club and bring this joy to my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should say that my experience with running has always been recreational, aside from the running I had to do for soccer and that I hated. And then as an adult, I was like, oh, I can enjoy this when I separate it from a thing I have to do, So I've not participated in running at a higher level, at a competitive level, at an elite level, none of those things. So yeah, my experience is wildly different than a lot of the athletes that I have also worked with, where that did trigger a lot of disordered eating and body image struggles and body dysmorphia because of the way the sport looks at a higher level most time, if we're thinking endurance, So yeah, those experiences can be totally different. And there often comes that light bulb moment of oh, whatever level I'm running at, I do need to respect what my body needs and respect that my body is my own and it's not anyone else's. It doesn't look like anyone else's. It doesn't have the same needs as anyone else's. I am a unique person. And so I can figure out what helps me stay active and maybe competitive in this sport versus what works for someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for you as well, I think from a business perspective, there's so many things I want to ask you, but that is when you do work one-on-one with clients, you do work a lot in a similar space to me of disordered eating and in athletics. And so even in sport, I think it's important because a lot of people in sports are oh, but weight is correlated to performance. And this is another subset, right? It's there's a weight-centric approach to nutrition and dietetics. And then in sports nutrition, as a sports dietitian, I'm oh my God, that was further advanced training where I'm now, calculating needs based on body weight or thinking what's, I was trained to do body composition testing, skinfold testing, DEXA scans, looking at body composition and how to change that throughout a training cycle or it's a whole nother level when it comes to sports nutrition of this weight centric approach. And I think it's just as toxic and harmful, but it has this shiny, glossy lens over it to be oh, but it's for performance.
Right. Yes. Yes. You described that so well. The shiny, glossy lens. Yeah. It's well, no. We'll just do this because you want to be faster, right? Or you want to be better. And I think there's so much to unpack there. And my experience, I don't work with clients one-on-one anymore, but when I did, again, it was mostly recreational. I had some collegiate athletes. I had some low, semi-pro athletes, but mostly I work with recreational athletes, meaning this is a thing we do for fun, maybe for health, maybe for joyful movement, whatever it is. And we had a lot of conversations around what is the importance of being faster? Because a lot of it, that's what it comes down to, right? If you're at your quote unquote race weight, there's the quotes again.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean? And how fast are you going to be? And how does that change your life? I am all for setting some goals, challenging yourself. I think it's fun. I do it for myself, but what's the cost of it? Right. And how do we decide for ourselves? What is kind of a healthy way to set goals or a healthy way to have, some challenges for ourselves or to chase down a PR in whatever distance? And at what cost are we willing to do that? And there is a point, there's this inflection point where you've gotten so rigid or you've focused so much on weight that your performance is actually going down, right? Or you're starting to become injured or not to, because we don't want to tie it all back to performance. How is that impacting the rest of your life, right? How much are you thinking about food? How much are you sleeping well? Are you preoccupied with food thoughts? Do you have food anxiety? How often are you weighing yourself and how does that impact your day? It all comes down to, for me, it was how is this impacting you overall? Not just how does this impact your sport? And I think in many sports and in sports dietetics, sometimes it is this tunnel vision of like, how does it impact the sport? That's all that matters, you know?
Yeah. But now here's an interesting thing. And I was like writing notes as you were talking, because I do work with a lot of recreational athletes, but I also do work with elite professional national champions. And so there is that extra, I think, pressure, spotlight, and expectation on them.
Yeah.
However, the things you said still apply. At what cost?
Yeah.
Let's start with that question. At what cost, right? A lot of athletes are like, I'll do anything and everything so that I can be number one. Okay. Sure. We can have that conversation. However, when we still think at what cost, if we are doing so much disordered eating behaviors or super focused on that weight, like performance is going to be affected at some point, and injuries. Those are the two, like, if that's what you care about is being number one athlete at the highest level, injury and performance declines. These are two very real things when we are engaging in super weight-centered practices and disordered eating practices. So like those are the two big things. And then that question of like, what about the remainder of your life? Like, how is this impacting your thoughts, obsessive thoughts, or your sleep, or just your mood in the day, your relationships? Like, guess what? When it comes down to performing at the highest level, if you're at the starting line and you're worried about what you ate for breakfast, or was it too much, or what am I going to eat after this race, then you're not focused on your race. So it's taking away from your performance, even at the highest of levels. Like, I think all the questions you just said for the recreational athlete can still be applied to the elite and high level athlete. And, you know, everything's still, again, like person to person, because I will say I've run across many athletes at a high level that are like, no, like I'll do anything and everything.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, you get to the top, like you don't want that to be it. Once you get to the top, you want to stay at the top. And that's where thinking of the long-term health, the long-term injury risk is like so important, even for our highest levels of athletes.
Right. Right. And I think that's also where like some athletes get stuck in sort of a vicious cycle of like, but when I did all these really extreme things and when I was really rigid, like I ran my fastest, and they have the blinders on of like, then I got injured, or then I couldn't repeat that result. Like it never got better. Like that was it. And they're like, I just have to get back to that. And it's like, can we, again, like I use this a lot. Can we zoom out and see that like that did happen? I'm not going to discredit the result of the event. And like, there's a reason it couldn't be repeated.
Exactly.
You know, like,
and there's another way that you can get to the top. You can reach the PR and repeat it.
Right.
And you have to go down that path.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is the path that you and I preach.
Yeah.
It's our path.
Yeah. And I think like there's a lot, again, like it's so easy to tie all this back to performance, and I don't mean to do that. And I think like it is really important for athletes to have a sense at whatever level, to have a sense of like what satisfies me, what feels like enough, like what's fun, what's challenging, like what fulfills me. And I think we see a lot of maybe like stories or literature or both about athletes who are like more well-rounded in what they do. Like maybe the highest level runner who like doesn't just run, like they actually enjoy swimming, or sometimes they just go for a hike, or they have families, or like when their life is not so centered around the sport and they have like mental space and energy for other things, it actually does like make them a better athlete, you know, which again, I don't mean to like elevate that as the ultimate being of like being the best athlete you can be no matter what level you participate at. Like that's not the end all be all, but I think because
it actually helps.
It does help. And like the limited view that we have of like what athletes do and don't do, which again, coming back to like the exposure we have to athletes now, like through social media, through different forms of news, through newsletters, through podcasts, like et cetera, it's easy to think like they just do these things and that's all they are as a person. And that's why they're the best. And I think at least for me, like when I take in these stories, I'm like, what I see is like the people who are performing at a high level and having fun and like really enjoying it, like they're doing lots of different things and they're doing it their own way. They're not following a script.
Anybody listening to this, I do just want to give a shout out to an episode I just aired with Olympic skier Haley Swirlbirl, that we literally talked about this exact thing of like, for her to be the top athlete to go to the Olympics is actually by like so much balance in her life. It's not all about skiing. It's not all about what she eats. It's about her friendships. It's about knitting. It's about like just all these other things. Right. So I would, anybody who wants to learn more about this from like a high level athlete themselves, I would refer to listen to that episode. So for you, Heather, like you already mentioned too, from a business perspective, you're no longer taking one-on-one clients. And one reason for that, to my knowledge, I'm sure there's lots of reasons, but is because you're really focused on WIND, which stands WIND, Weight Inclusive Nutrition and Dietetics. So you founded this or co-founded this?
Founded this.
Let me give you 110% of the credit. You founded WIND in 2018. It's Lane 9 that you co-founded, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, we can talk about that too. But I think WIND is like, it says it in the name, Weight Inclusive Nutrition and Dietetics. So community and resources for other dietitians, maybe dietetic students, like, and something that I am now signed, I'm on the newsletter. I'm like, I need to be part of this. So can you tell us more about the inception of it, the importance of starting this and what your mission is?
Sure. Yeah. So I think for some reason, the first thing that comes to mind for me to call out is like, if anyone's into the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 7, which means that I seek novelty and I have ideas and I just like follow the road. I'm like, yeah, let's do that. So there was never going to be a world in which like I only saw private practice clients and that's all I could do because like my brain just like can't function that way. So I did stop seeing clients, which was partially related to wanting to like give WIND more of my energy and partially related to the fact that I have 3 kids. And they're all very little. So it's not a season of life for me that feels accessible to doing a lot of one-on-one, like time-based things. So WIND is great for that reason as well. So the inception for WIND, well, I also want to highlight, like when I say I founded WIND, like, yes, I started this company, but like with the knowledge that I've gained from other folks who have done so much work in this space to make weight inclusive care something that's even on our radars, right? And that goes back to the history of HAES and also the history of fat liberation. So like that work is what informs what we do through WIND. And basically WIND started because I was very tired of going to conferences, nutrition conferences, you know, the one I'm talking about, like the big ones, and just being like, wow, there's like one session that's weight inclusive and then like 99 that are not. So like, tell me your agenda, Academy, you know? And like, something I say a lot within, like, this applies to academics and like how we teach students in the nutrition space. And I think the healthcare space at large. And it should be applied to like larger organizations like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Like, we're not teaching people how to think or how to examine literature. We're telling them what to think. It's like, this is the way that you do it. Not like, here's a lot of information and there are different ways to approach all of these different areas of practice. And like, here's some evidence. Take it and examine it and like take the key findings and apply them to your practice, you know? So basically, like I was in DC at the time, Fancy was coming to DC and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to that. There's like 2 sessions that are weight inclusive. And one of them, they couldn't even like just let it be a session. It was a debate about HAES. And it was a dietitian, Christy Harrison, whom they invited to speak. And they said like, will you come speak about HAES? And then they were like, actually, it's not going to be a session. It's a debate. And we're going to bring a doctor into the debate. So it just, so I don't know. I could,
that just feels
we could unpack that.
It's like, you can have all these other sessions where we're just going to tell you, we're just going to teach you, but this one's going to invite you in, but challenge you.
We're going to challenge it. Exactly. And so I was like, yeah, enough of that. So WIND is just like me saying like, let's just have a conference and like, let's just have it be weight inclusive, which one could argue I'm kind of doing the exact same thing, but just flipping it on its head. But it's, you know, we bring in speakers that you wouldn't normally see at dietetic conferences. Like as we've gone through the years, like definitely started with a lot of dietitians who spoke. And it's now more of like, we are interested in people with lived experience. We're interested in hearing from activists. We're interested in hearing from people in public health who don't hold like credentials, but have a lot of career experience or lobbying experience or whatever. And so it serves as a place for education. And then it also serves as a community because as you know, like in the dietetic space at large and also the healthcare space at large, like it can feel very isolating to be maybe one of the only practitioners who's not practicing in a weight-centric way. And so kind of creating that space where we can come together and talk through like challenges in the workspace or challenges with clients or challenges with education programs, like whatever it is, it's just nice to know that there are other people who are here to support you and to feel connected to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And so who can join? How do people join?
Yeah. So in the name, we do have nutrition and dietetics. So it is primarily dietitians, but we've had a variety of folks join events and the Facebook group. So we've had health coaches, life coaches, physicians, physical therapists, talk therapists, students, interns. It is more for practitioners and activists, like I mentioned earlier, as does like the community at large, but WIND does focus more on the education piece. So I would say that in joining, you're going to see more conversations around like actual practices in weight inclusive care and research in weight inclusive care and how this might apply to different sectors of dietetics or sectors of healthcare, et cetera. So the practitioner or activist is kind of the person that would get the most out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So me. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I do get a lot of, I think, other fellow dietitians and RD2B listeners. As many podcasts about nutrition do, you're going to get people. So I think that I just definitely want to highlight and direct them, and we'll include some stuff in the show notes about WIND and just how to learn more or maybe be a part of it too.
Cool. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, Heather. So one other thing I just want to bring light to is your, again, you as a business owner, a dietitian, and you were also a podcast host for 5 years, RD Real Talk. You have over 200 episodes, but your latest episode, which is just this past month, actually was saying that, okay, we're saying goodbye to the RD Real Talk podcast. And it's interesting because my last podcast episode that was just released, so it might be 2 or 3 by the time this one is aired, was just a solo one where I was telling my listeners about how after having Gabe, having a kid, just like things have changed. And so there's some business changes. And I first honestly just wanted to tell you, one, thank you for all that you've already done and your 200 plus episodes that have inspired and educated others, but also like your honesty and transparency in that episode of just like, hey, like when life changes, things have to change and something has to give. And it seemed like that was one of the things that was like, you know what, this podcast can end.
Yeah.
So that I can do other things. And so I honestly just wanted to say thank you because it was helpful to hear that.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah. I mean, I've had many experiences over the years where like I have felt like I have permission from someone who doesn't know me. I'm like, oh, I saw this person do that thing or talk about that thing. So now I feel like it's okay for me to do it. And like, we don't need permission. I think I actually said that on that episode. Like, we don't need permission from anybody, but sometimes it helps to have an example, like I mean, the podcast was so much fun and I got a lot out of it. And like, I had a moment earlier this year where I'm like, I started running again post baby and like actually want to set some goals around that. And I want to have like the mental space for that. And like, I'm still learning. Like our youngest is 14 months. And I'm like, I feel like I'm still learning like what it means to really like be a parent of 3 kids and like how much that takes up in my life. And I have to have space for that. And so like, alluding earlier to my Enneagram 7-ness where like I do tend to do a lot of things and like that is fun and fulfilling for me versus like focusing on one thing. I am learning that there's a limit to that. There's only so much. So it was just like, okay, this is one thing that like I could end and it would probably feel good to get some of that space back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, just for me on a personal level and other women listening, this is a female athlete nutrition podcast. Like we can't do it all. We as women do a lot and we should be proud of that. But like the way that you're going to be able to get back into running and set some goals there. Like if you want to say yes to that, you have to say no to some other things. And so it's just a constant reevaluation of where am I at? What are my priorities? Where do I want to be? And figuring out what to say no to so that you can say yes to other things.
Yeah. And I think I do want to call out like kind of a theme that we've talked about here is like how much we see other people doing on social media. And we see what they're doing, but we don't see what they're not doing. Right? Like we don't see that like the mom who had a baby or parent who had a baby and like decided to run a marathon 10 months later, like what did they give up? And that's not to say I have any judgment around what they gave up or what they didn't. But I think like it's easy to see those types of narratives and be like, oh, they just did it all. Like I've had so many people since having my first, who's now 4.5, who've asked me like, well, how do you do the podcast and like see clients with your kids? I'm like, we have childcare. Like, what do you think I'm just doing this like during nap time? I'm not doing this during nap time. That's not how this works. But like, maybe I don't talk that much about childcare. So maybe that's not a piece that people see. So I think like relevant to all of the above is like, we do have access. We have more and more access to like what parents are doing, what business owners are doing, what dietitians are doing, what athletes are doing. But it would behoove us to question like, what are they not doing anymore? What do I not see that's part of this puzzle for them? And so my like personal, like deep core belief has always been like, when we talk about those things or when we show the things that we don't always think to show, it helps someone else feel less alone. Like maybe just one person, but like that's enough for me to feel great when I see someone else do it. So like pay it forward, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I have not been cleaning. So there's a lot of things I've not been doing.
Yeah, cleaning, just one of them. We'll just add that to the list.
Showers, not really doing that.
Yeah. Okay. Oh my gosh.
Well, Heather, this has been so awesome. I know you're going to have to go, but I do end every podcast with the same 4 questions for all of my guests. So I want to play along real quickly. If there was one food you could eat every single day for the rest of your life and never get sick of it, what would that be?
Oof. Someone asked me this recently and my answer was breakfast burritos. So like, I don't know if it's true that I could eat those for the rest of my life, but they've been a staple for at least a few years. So I'm going to go with that.
Love it. Love it. What's your favorite sport to participate in?
I should say running because that's the sport I do most often, but I actually really love soccer. I just don't play soccer right now. It's not a season for that. So
yeah,
one of those two.
One of those two.
Yeah.
How about as a spectator? Is it different? Do you have a favorite sport to watch and cheer on?
It sounds kind of cliche, but I do love watching gymnastics. I just feel like it's like I'm watching sorcery. Like, how is that even possible? And I also really enjoy watching soccer.
Yeah. Cool. And then final question, if there's a female athlete out there that you think is inspiring, a role model, somebody who is what I call fiercely fit and fueled, like who would that be and why?
No pressure. First person that comes to mind is Alicia Montano. I like adore her. I like everything she does in the space for parents, runners, like women, athletes, everything. I love her. Yeah.
Amazing. Shout out to Alicia Montano and shout out to you, Heather. Thank you so much. I will include some links and show notes to Wind, to your website and all that you're doing, your Instagram handles, things like that. And thank you so much for being an amazing dietitian. And again, even though RD Real Talk podcast is at this moment in time, no more future episodes, like I said, like go listen because you got over 200 episodes of like good quality information in there. So that's the cool thing about podcasts.
I know. Yeah. I'm like, the episodes are there. So just like go back and listen to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed that episode and thanks for listening. But before I let you go, I have free resources that you can have access to right away, right now, so that you can start fueling your body as a fierce, fit, and fueled female athlete. First, I have your Red S recovery race. If you've ever wondered if you might be struggling with Red S, curious to learn more, or know you have Red S and are looking to recover fast, then you can head to www.riseupnutritionrun.com/RedS and download the Red S recovery race. See how you place and figure out the next steps to recovery. Plus, while there, I have a few other great resources for you, including 3 nutrition secrets that every elite athlete swears by and access to our private Facebook community, Female Athlete Nutrition. So again, to gain access to all of this, head to riseupnutritionrun.com/REDS. That's /REDS. And you can gain access and get the help you need fast. Too many girls and women and female athletes struggle with nutrition, but you don't have to any longer. Become fierce, fit, and fueled. Links in the show notes, and I'll see you next time.